Hello and welcome to today's virtual briefing. I'm Greg Williams. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Wired and I'm delighted to host this virtual briefing with our partner, Accenture. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we're going to be reflecting on the unprecedented challenges of the past few months, thinking about the impacts the pandemic has had on our organizations and how we can implement change to prepare for future disruption. Joining us today, we have three speakers who have been reflecting on the changes of the past few months and considering what we need to do both individually and organisationally to prepare for what's coming next. Firstly, Rachel Barton, who is Head of Strategy and Consulting at Accenture. Rachel works with some of the UK's largest companies, advising business leaders on how they can drive a growth agenda, and was recently voted the Most Inspirational Leader at Accenture UK. Congratulations, Rachel. We could all do with some inspiration. We're also joined by Paulette, Rowe, the CEO of Integrated and E-commerce Solutions at Paysafe Group. Prior to her role at Paysafe, Paulette was Head of Payments and Financial Services Partnerships at Facebook. This year, she has been recognised as one of the top 50 most influential leaders in European financial services. And lastly, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Reuben, economist and CEO of the IDFC Institute in India. Reuben's expertise lies in understanding the underlying processes of economic development with a focus on state capacity, institutions, and the intersection of public policy and politics. Reuben also serves on the World Economic Forum's Council on Cities and Urbanization. So Reuben, we're going to start with you. Welcome. I'm hoping you can give us sort of some global context to this discussion, just to frame things, and then we can maybe dig a little bit deeper into the business impact with Paulette and Rachel. So just a first sense from you, Reuben. I'm really interested to get a sense of what are the key learnings that you've had regarding the crisis, and at a global level, how do you think about the response of various governments and organisations around the world? Big question, I know, to begin, but let's try and frame it in some way.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Greg, for having me. So I think the best way to sort of start this discussion is just to put it up front that, I've heard a lot of discussion in a lot of fora that this was some sort of black swan event. And I just want to, first of all, just refute that, right? Because there was nothing black swan about it. It was being predicted by all and sundry. In fact, if you had a movie, Contagion, that was made in 2011, almost by definition, this is not a black swan, right? I mean, it's one of these things that was lying in wait and none of us were prepared. So just to give you some context out here, in 2015, there was a peer-reviewed scientific paper that had come out with the title SARS-like coronavirus propagating in bats ready for human emergence. This is, by the way, the title of the paper, right? So you can go into, so it's like everybody in the scientific community knew this was coming, et cetera, and yet somehow we were completely blindsided by it. And one of the reasons we were blindsided by it is also the fact that perhaps China did not take its role seriously, didn't give out the information in time, but equally, I think, and this becomes very clear if you speak to anyone in Taiwan, which is that the Taiwanese had figured out what was coming by mid-December. So they had a plan in place by December 30th, and their epidemic preparedness center within their CDC had moved to alarm levels by early January. And by the way, the Taiwanese were also raising red flags for the rest of us. Now, the problem is Taiwan is not part of any of the big international multilateral organizations, but specifically the WHO. So therefore, the Taiwanese warnings were basically disregarded. And then Nassim Taleb, who famously coined the term black swan, actually had a paper that was published on January 26th, in which he basically said, look, unlike, say, an Ebola, because this crisis was basically coming out of, the virus was coming out of China, and China happens to be super connected, you're going to have the spread of the virus that is going to be non-linear. And we must be prepared for a non-linear sort of spread of the virus. And one of the things that he said at that particular point of time was the day the number of deaths cross 1,000 is when you've got to basically behave like this is the big one. So that again brings out the question of like, how do we think about tail risk and how do we prepare for tail risk events going forward? So I think that's broadly just to set the stage in terms of where this came from and the fact that it's just basically the global community was just, the warning signs were there, but we just didn't know how to respond.
So you mentioned Taiwan. Just thinking governmentally and organizationally, which approaches that you've seen have been successful and which haven't? I'm interested to get your sense of you mentioned the global picture. What's working? What isn't?
So I think, so we've been doing a bunch of case studies on what we believe to be really good government responses. So starting with Taiwan, but then Vietnam. We've also looked at the state of Kerala in India, which had an extraordinary response. So by the way, I mean, I'm also fascinated that none of these are actually well-known examples in the West, where most of the conversation tends to be around, around Germany. And the fact of the matter is that Germany's got 200,000 cases and Taiwan has 480 cases, right? This is the gap. And yet nobody seems to understand what Taiwan had actually done. So if you now, with the benefit of hindsight, have done all of these cases, if I had to point to one single thing that made a difference in the way the government responded, is previous experience with a pandemic or previous experience with any sort of outbreak has made a huge difference in the way governments have responded. So even subnationally, so in the case of India, the reason why Kerala had such a prompt response. So just to give you context here as well, the health ministry of the state of Kerala had actually got a list of every single person from the state who happened to be in the province of Hubei by January 2nd week, right? That was the sort of alacrity with which they had responded. Again, because the state of Kerala in 2016 had dealt with an outbreak of the Nipah virus. So any government that has had to deal with an outbreak in the past tends to be a government that responds very, very quickly. So, things like mask wearing, all of that became very quickly de rigueur in a lot of these environments.
And do you think to some degree, because they've had experience of dealing with, fast-growing pandemics, that they've managed to remove the politics and that what we need to be thinking about in other territories that maybe haven't been so successful is how we remove politics from this kind of situation in the future, how we maybe sort of build some kind of, Cobra-type mechanism?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to note here is to have some sort of heuristic in place. Right? And I think that's what most of these countries basically had, which is what the heuristics are basically if X, then Y kind of response. And if you have a set of heuristics like that, then chances are, I'm not saying you can remove all of the politics, but I think you can remove a lot of the politics going forward. So for instance, the fact that Taiwan had moved to a level of epidemic preparedness by early January means that they had a suite of things that would be put into place as a consequence of having moved to this level of preparedness. So I think that if X then Y kind of approach is very helpful. So going forward, if I were to just, play out a hypothetical case, if you had another respiratory virus that broke out that had an R0 of over 2, then basically mask wearing be made mandatory in public places, right? That's the sort of heuristic that could potentially be put into place. I'm not necessarily sure it'll work, but I think at least some of the politicking could be taken away.
I'd love to bring Rachel and Paulette in a second. Just want a couple more questions for you, Reuben, just to get a sort of sense again of the global picture. A lot of conversation, around global supply chains. What's your instinct? Was there going to be a new kind of localism, do you think, emerging after this?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I've sort of been able to sense in my conversations with numerous sort of global governments is that there's two things that are happening. One is there is, broadly speaking, there's a certain discontent with the way China has handled the crisis, right? In the early days, the lack of transparency has obviously bothered a lot of people. But I think more importantly, what I think a lot of people have sort of arriving at is you do not want to concentrate risk in the supply chain the way it has been until now, because it has been very clear that these sort of just-in-time sort of processes have enormous fragility sort of built in an event like this. So for instance, just to give you an example of this, and I'll take the example of India here. So about 70% of India's active pharmaceutical ingredients basically are produced in China. And that number goes up to about 100% if you're talking about things like paracetamol or ibuprofen, right? And by the way, India has a very large pharmaceutical industry of its own. So if you look at US and UK numbers, US and UK haven't produced these things for well over a decade.
Yeah,
right?
I think most paracetamol we consume in the UK is actually manufactured in India.
There you go. So I think those are the sort of things where you do not want to concentrate all your risk into one environment is something that is definitely going to emerge out of this pandemic, which I believe will then lead to a restructuring of global supply chains. And there's a bunch of countries that are likely to benefit from that. Vietnam, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Some of this may actually move closer to home, right? I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if some of this manufacturing actually moves back to Europe or somewhere close to Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, or Mexico. I think you're going to see a certain re-engineering of the supply chain going forward.
Interesting thoughts. Thank you, Reuben, for setting up the conversation. Rachel, maybe I can bring you in, and Paulette at this point. Rachel, maybe you could take this first question, and Paulette, if you'd like to jump in as well, and Reuben. So, thinking about organisations now specifically, we're hearing so much now about the way that businesses are restructuring workforces with this kind of massive shift that's been going on in many industries. How do you think about these kind of challenges that organisations are facing?
Thanks, Greg. And I thought, Reuben, your framing was great, because there are a few points that I will bounce on. I mean, I would go back to some of the basics, actually. One of them Reuben touched on, in that we tend to use this phrase at the moment, the new normal. And I would challenge that we are in a new normal. I don't like the term, and I think it's probably lazily used, because this was not a black swan event in the way that Reuben described, but also from a business perspective, I don't think this created many surprises for us. Actually, the resilience within the way that businesses operate was relatively low. The cost structures that supported businesses were too high. The level of automation was low, and therefore the workforce, although we have, of course, made shifts over the last few years, has not been radically different. And I think out of this period, we will start to see glimpses of change that really we could have thought more carefully about many, many years ago. There will be some brilliant things, such as the inclusive and diverse nature of the workforce that we can now and should now be thinking much more seriously about. And we think about people with disabilities who may have been constrained, moving between different physical locations. There is absolutely nothing now that should constrain individuals entering the workforce. The kind of hours that people are working are now far more flexible, and there's a greater level of trust that businesses have had to create within their ecosystems about productivity, that again, I would hope carries on, that allows far more people to enter the workforce and work flexibly than before. But also, I think this has exposed some big questions around the use of technology. In fact, you think about 2020 has in many ways marked the first decade of delivery on the true promise of digital. We've been playing around for the last decade. We've been focusing our efforts on digitization into how to get people to buy more on Amazon, not really to truly create digital backbones that run across our own businesses and that of our ecosystems in a way that really brings, the power of automation and the unleashing of human potential to the fore. So I think that there are lots of things that we've learned, lots of things that we've seen glimpses of, lots of non-surprises, that actually we've got a shot at really facing into as we emerge from COVID and think about what that means for our workforce in a sustained way, to accelerate the transformation of business.
Well, I'd love you to maybe reflect on some of what we've heard thus far, and also maybe, what's your perspective on the kind of the assumptions that organisations are now going to have to build into their strategic thinking when they consider the future?
Yeah, thanks, first of all, Greg, for inviting me to today's panel. Absolutely fascinated by Reuben's comments, and yeah, definitely, Rachel, agree with a lot of what you've just said. I think my first assumption, as you mentioned, I work at Paysafe. We have about 250,000 merchants that are our clients, and dotted across North America and Europe and elsewhere. So we've sort of had a UK, but also a much broader perspective. And it's been feeling, I guess the first thing I would say is it's going to be very bumpy ahead. As Reuben said, there's still that chance of potentially a second wave. And what we have seen is, the consumer confidence so far has been reasonably strong, but of course that's about to change. Government intervention has propped up defaults, bankruptcies, but a number of businesses have been severely damaged. So, the first thing is about building adaptability, flexibility, agility, the things that Rachel has touched on, because we don't know what's ahead. In our case, yes, we're thinking harder about automation. We're thinking harder about how to re-engineer our cost base, not only so that we can weather any short-term shocks, but also to make sure we have the room to invest in new business models. Rachel talks about technology. I think one of the really interesting things that I see with the customers, the clients that I work with, and in fact we're all experiencing, is the adoption of digital. I think it was the Microsoft CEO that said that there's been sort of 2 years of digital transformation in just 2 months, and we're all seeing it, whether we're buying a pint in the pub on our smartphone now, or I think Asda is trialing automation, robots, the cleaning robots in their stores. If you want to buy makeup, you can now do that using an AR experience, because you're no longer able to try makeup on in the stores due to social distancing. And just picking up on what Rachel said about how these are things that have already been there. I remember when I started working in payments, talking an awful lot about omni-channel, and every presentation I went to was about omni-channel. And yet it's, as the examples of omni-channel were literally, can I order online and pick up in store? That was as creative as we were tending to get. Yet now that blurring of the face-to-face, the physical and the online, is starting to take a completely different direction and to become much, much more exciting. So, on the one hand, I would say to businesses, assume, plan for some very difficult times ahead. Small businesses, individuals, there's going to be, hard times ahead of us. And some industries may well not recover without adequate support. But then this digital revolution, you've got to understand it. You've got to understand how to change your business model. And one quick example of that is we work with Mindbody, which is one of the leading software vendor, in fact, for the wellness industry. And we all know how hard that industry's been impacted by COVID. But they accelerated the rollout of a virtual platform that allowed gyms and martial arts studios and the like to put content, video content to go online, which for many of them was the difference between going out of business forever and being able to sort of keep going until lockdown was eased.
I think that, yeah, absolutely. That kind of level of innovation is been really interesting. And maybe, Rachel, I can kind of ask you about that as well. The kind of adjustments, the innovations that you're seeing. You're working with a lot of interesting organisations. What shows signs of working?
So many things show signs of working. And actually, Paulette talked about payments, and that. I think that's a fascinating part of the broader ecosystem at the moment, because when you think about the role that a bank has served in society, and the fact that banks are now looking long and hard, and they've been looking long and hard for a long time at the real estate that they have, but now is the time to really face into that. And the fact that we're not earning any interest on our savings. Well, what is a bank? What's a payment? How are we going to accumulate wealth? Perhaps it's through the whiskey that we've been gifted. If you read the press and the stories of the lucky 18-year-old boy who's cashing in and buying his first home. There will be different ways of making money and accumulating wealth, and the banking / payment / wealth industry, I think, is going to change dramatically. You also think about gamification and the fact that we're now, particularly in the hospitality or the entertainment industries, seeing dramatic shifts in how revenue is created. But then equally, we're seeing events, concerts move to gamified experiences where you're able to create that same vibe with people sitting at home. We've been talking about immersive experiences in theatre for ages now, but suddenly it's a way to immediately connect with the mass market. And I think we'll be seeing that used as a commerce channel very, very quickly as well. So I think there are some really exciting innovations emerging that, because humans are curious by nature, we find a way of creating balance. That the one that I don't feel I've seen enough of yet, but I think is so critical to help us come out of the challenging period that we're in, is the role that business plays to continue to blur some of the lines between business and society. Now, I think we have seen a few examples of that, and I think to the fact that Prada, very quickly repurposed its perfume laboratories to create hand sanitizer, or Burberry started to create PPE equipment. But they are really important signals of the role that business needs to continue to play, not in a crisis mode, but in a BAU mode that is more about just supporting shareholders and the innovation of their own products to create their own health as a business. I think we're going to need to see that permeate much more into society, because governments alone are not going to be able to fix or sustain life as we continue to operate in this challenging environment.
No, absolutely, and that's going to be an interesting shift as things move forward. Reuben, I'm interested to kind of bring you back in at this point. Rachel earlier on mentioned in her comments that the phrase "the new normal," which seems to be something that it's a phrase that people are agreeing is probably there is going to be no new normal. I'm interested to get your perspective, just from a global point of view, like what what changes do you think are going to stick and what won't as we move forward?
Thanks, Craig. With astounding timing, I've got somebody starting to drill in one of the apartments above me or something of the sort, which tells you exactly what the problem with the new normal is.
I've got someone calling my landline as well.
I thought we are prepared for every eventuality here, but the drilling. So I apologize in advance for that. Look, I think you pose an interesting question. I think we need to realize. I mean, virtually every single person on this call, and most people like us, are basically the beneficiaries of we can work from home, all of those wonderful things. But we also must be aware of the fact that we are a tiny minority of the global population that actually has this privilege. So even if I look at at India as an example, I mean, the service sector is tiny compared to in terms of employment, in terms compared to the rest of the economy. And in the service sector as well, the people who can actually afford to do this sort of thing is actually minuscule. So, I mean, for instance, if you're a country that basically your economic base is manufacturing, let's take that as an example. I mean, you can't manufacture working from home, right? You still have to show up at a factory floor. In environments like India or many parts of Africa, the vast majority of the economy is in the informal sector. It's your roadside stores, it's the mom and pop stores, all of those. I mean, none of that is amenable to working from home. So we have to be very, very careful about what we are talking about here. We are talking about something that applies to a microscopic minority of the global population. So let's just be clear about that. The other problem is, this point has been made by many commentators, but also keep in mind the fact that this also loads the dice massively in favor of people who are rich, who already have the resources. So let's just talk about schools, for instance, right? I mean, so everybody talks about online learning as an alternative. I mean, I was looking at some pictures out of Indonesia, Bangladesh, etc., where these poor kids are basically trying to find some spot where they can actually get connectivity so that they can actually latch on to something that allows you to do online learning. So this is actually going to exaggerate existing cleavages in society. I think the poor are going to get disproportionately hit by the so-called new normal. So seen from my perspective, looking at the globe at large, I think we should try and get back to the old normal, because otherwise you're going to leave a lot of people behind in the process, but very specifically the poor, minorities, and so on and so forth. We should be very careful about what we are talking about here.
Great. Greg, maybe just to add to Reuben's point, because it's something that we're seeing as well at Paysafe, because we have an e-cash product which allows consumers to actually turn cash into digital currencies that they can transact online. And it's been interesting that during the pandemic, we've actually seen an increase in active accounts, and we offer this service in 40 plus countries. But it's exactly that point. Even in some of the countries that you're referring to, Reuben, even in the West, there is that polarization that we're going to see of the people that are actually able to weather the storm, and then people who are perhaps furloughed today, who become permanently unemployed, or for example, 2 million people in the UK who don't have access to a bank account today. As the economy becomes more digitized, and I do think that this is a permanent shift. I mean, Reuben, you mentioned SARS. I think we can all see the impact that SARS had on China in terms of that permanent shift to digital financial services, for example. So yeah, there is a big issue here in terms of how do we make sure that people don't get left behind, and we're hoping that the merchants, the clients that we work with, consider not just the people who throughout this pandemic have embraced new payment methods or new technologies, but also those people in home markets but overseas, as you've pointed out, Reuben, who don't have that same access. And if I may, just one other point, because Rachel, your point sort of sparked a thought in terms of that overall sort of purpose and responsibility. And again, maybe just using an example from my sector and my company. When this sort of pandemic when the pandemic happens, risk management goes to the top of agenda for payments companies, financial institutions, and getting that balance. I think there is a sort of responsibility there in terms of how do you get that balance between protecting your own financial future, but being very aware that actually you've got a responsibility within the ecosystem. I think Virgin Atlantic was sort of talking to their payment providers because they were holding sort of 200 million of security, which they badly need as part of that rescue package to improve their liquidity. So innovation needs to come in that direction as well. And we've been looking at things like how do we work with our airline clients, new solutions. That means that we don't have to hold such high security levels, so that they can actually get through and get through this stage, rather than imposing more restrictions on them that's only going to make those businesses struggle.
Yeah, on that point, Rachel, just following up from what Paulette was saying, you're speaking to a lot of organisations. How do you think they should be, considering or looking at, the opportunities afforded by this new landscape?
So, I think Paulette, you touched on this. It's a fine balance between creating a cost structure that is going to provide you with the investment capacity to innovate, because actually that freed up cash has to be created somehow, whilst also not using that investment capacity to only further automate and remove jobs from the ecosystem. We've actually got to create growth, and it is there is a responsibility that business holds, and many of our clients are working through this at the moment. What's the responsibility that they hold to create the jobs of the future, to drive growth, whilst at the same time creating cost structures that have a greater level of resilience baked into them and an ability to free up investment capacity that fuels that growth. And that means using technology in much cleverer ways, but being connected to an ecosystem in a way that is much bolder and more well architected than it has been before. I mean, you talked, Paulette, about the different sort of commercial constructs almost, or partnerships that you're putting in place. And that is absolutely critical, because no business can operate in the same standalone way that it did before. Actually, we've got to work in conjunction with our partners, with our customers, with our shareholders, with our governments, in a way that is far more fluid than it's previously been. If you're a consumer goods organisation, we've got to think about that supply chain point that Reuben's mentioned. We've also got to think about the relationship with some of the big platform players like Microsoft, Amazon, Google. We've also got to think about the role of retail. Are you going to start to cannibalize your retail B2B customers, or are you going to now start to provide a different service to them? What's your role in e-commerce? All of that has got to be thought about much more strategically than it has been before, because the role and purpose of business is going to be much more fluid and far more critical. And I think the commercial construct that underpins that is one that we're going to have to be more and more creative around. And I love the example that Paulette gave, because it's what we're seeing work at the moment within our client base.
So we've got a couple more minutes before we can move to Q&A. It's got some good questions coming in, but I'd love to just have a sort of like a final question for each of you, if you could answer relatively briefly, if you don't mind, please. Around leadership, we haven't really touched on leadership, so I'm interested to get your thoughts, and maybe Reuben, you could start. What's successful leadership going to look like in the coming years?
Oh, I mean, that's a loaded question. I mean, I don't think the nature of leadership is necessarily affected. I certainly think that, my definition of who a leader should be is no different today than it was earlier. The one thing that I would add to that mix is, I think we are entering a world of tail risk. So whether it's climate change or, you name it, pandemics, I think leadership and global leaders, whether you're a political leader or you're a business leader, I think you need to be much more aware of the fact that we are in a world of tail risk. And so to be much more sharply aware of these tail risk events and what could be coming down the pike, which massively impacts not just, government and society, but absolutely affects your business. So, I guess nobody took pandemic seriously until pandemics began to absolutely destroy your business, right? So I think that's the one thing that I would sort of add to leadership. To the extent that political leaders should be aware of, so exactly what we were just discussing. I suspect that what you're going to see is what economists call a K-shaped recovery, right? Which is one is going up and the other is going down. And I think political leaders would be well sort of, they should be well aware of the fact that there are political consequences to those cleavages actually widening.
Yeah, absolutely. Paulette, any thoughts on that from like an organizational point of view rather than a political one?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think leadership is changing, actually. So I get Reuben's point, but I think if you assume, maybe if we sort of talk more about the UK, you know, people aren't going to be going back to the office in the same way for, I think, the foreseeable future. And so, you know, we are thinking about how do you create that new leader that has that human touch? Suddenly, you're inside someone's home having that one-to-one, having that team meeting, and we've all had the experience of the cat or the landline or the construction going on. So I think leaders will need to be equipped with different skills in order to engage and ensure that the culture of the organization still works with some of these remote models that we're looking to pursue. And as Rachel mentioned, I think D&I has to be on the agenda. You know, this hasn't just been a period about the pandemic. This has also been a period about D&I, but also remote working, as Rachel pointed out, opens up those possibilities. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg is talking about Facebook, where I worked, where it always used to be about the free food and all of that stuff, you know, where he's sort of saying people can work from home. Opens up all sorts of possibilities for people who wouldn't have normally wanted to work in San Francisco or had the physical ability to work in that office environment. So that's very exciting. And then this risk management point, which, you know, Reuben touched on again in terms of this tail risk, I think is extremely important. Most of my career was actually in banking before I moved into payments proper, and, you know, we were being forced by the FCA, etc., to do stress scenarios, etc. And I think these skills of understanding what are the macro risks and how might they impact your business need to be adopted, not just by big banks, but by all of us, because I think these risks, these shocks are still out there.
Great, thank you, Paulette. Rachel, any brief thoughts on leadership before we move on to Q&A?
So, like Paulette, I do think it will be different. I think we have to make it different as well. It's probably been too unchanged for a while. So we should look for talent in new places because there are no constraints now, certainly in our type of work. I think we need to be more responsible as leaders for creating the growth and the jobs and stimulating the economy beyond just the role that we play for our own shareholders. And I also think that we need to be very aware of how to create a following and loyalty as part of this new employee value proposition. And to the point that Paulette made, it's going to be really hard to attract talent because the value proposition is in a way far simpler. You're not attracted to the free food, the fancy canteen, the beautiful office. It's going to be much easier to move jobs because you're staring at one screen with 5 people, and now it's the same screen with a different 5 people. The loyalty around top talent is going to be far harder, I think, to grab hold of, and our leaders are going to have to be really aware of that in order to attract that talent and win in the marketplace.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm just wondering if each of you might like to take a quick look at the Q&A, which you should be able to access at the bottom of your screen, and see if there's a question that maybe you'd like to briefly take on. Let me know if there's something that you see that intrigues you. We've got a bunch of interesting questions around future of work and how organisations are going to change as they kind of we move forward. Paulette, you're nodding. Is there anything that caught your eye?
Yes, well, this one's from anonymous attendee, but I think there are quite a few questions, as you say, about remote working and how can we replace the face-to-face interaction that especially new entry level workers need to excel in business. And yeah, just sort of building on Rachel's last comments, as a company, we are doing a lot of work on a lot of research and thinking around the future of work. And whilst we know that a large number of our employees do value this remote working, and we're looking at ways to recreate, for example, the virtual water cooler conversation. So we're sort of creating little hubs of people to sort of come together informally. We also recognize that, especially for younger people, as the questioner has asked, that they often want to be in the office. They miss that interaction and the career and development opportunities that go with being in the office. So I think for us, that the thinking is that work will be less a mandatory workplace, but more a place to come in and socialize, receive that training, and make it more of a social experience, so that you can have a mixture of the two. And to Rachel's point about the employee value proposition, yes, it's not just about the remote working, but it's about, how seriously are you taking diversity and inclusion as an organization? Do you have a sense of purpose? Like a lot of companies, we're thinking and doing a lot around climate change and our carbon footprint. And in some ways, remote working will help us potentially reduce that. So it's all of those things together that I think are going to create that new value proposition. But we're already feeling it in places like we have a team in India. We're feeling exactly what Rachel describes, that war for talent. We are also saying we can go anywhere and grab talent, but so is the competition. So it's really going to come down to, I think, being much more flexible and much more inclusive in terms of that work environment that we create.
Thank you. Reuben, anything that caught your attention on the Q&A?
There was a question on privacy that I'll just quickly take, because I think that it's a crucial question, because today we've got all these apps that are supposedly helping you with contact tracing and whatnot. There's a bunch of platforms, ad tech platforms, that have been sort of repurposed to do contact tracing. There's all these legislations that have sort of come in and so on. So I mean, clearly exceptional circumstances call for exceptional action. The real question is what happens when the circumstances pass. And in our sort of experience, it's very rare that a government, for instance, that actually has got this power actually gives it away, right? So so you've got to really ask the question, these emergency legislations that governments have put into place, are they going to basically revoke it now at the end of these circumstances? And will they also revoke their right to the access to personal data, right? Similarly, private companies that also have had some of that. What happens to the data at that point? I mean, will organizations delete this data? Will individuals be notified that this data was shared? I think there's a whole bunch of governance questions around this that, I certainly haven't seen a public enough discussion about it, but I think that discussion really needs to happen because it's all of our data at stake, and a lot of this data has been made available in the name of public health. And we must be careful to make sure that A, it's not misused currently, and to make sure that it's not misused in the future.
Thank you, Reuben. Rachel, finally, is there a question you'd like to take on that has caught your eye?
Maybe to touch on an area that hasn't been covered. There's a question here about the role of cloud in the economic recovery, and maybe we extend that to talk about technology more broadly. But yes, cloud absolutely has a place insofar as it has the ability to accelerate the shift in some of those cost structures that have been spoken about, freeing up the investment capacity that is so needed to drive growth. But I think as well, let's try and step back and think about the broader landscape and those that tail that Reuben was describing, because we are not out the woods yet, and there are other things happening in the global arena beyond the pandemic that we need to take seriously. So using technology in the right way to truly enable business change and transformation can get you closer to that purpose, allow you to create the traceability of your supply chain, allow you to accelerate your sustainability agenda. It can reduce your carbon footprint. It can allow the role of the human to be elevated because you've shifted the role that people play within your business. And it can connect you to that broader ecosystem. That means that we can start to cut through, the silos that individual businesses create into something where I think as businesses we can create a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts, and sort of continue to stride firmly into this place of a different future, which is more inclusive and diverse and is more about purpose and is accepting of the blurring between society and business. But technology is a great enabler and platform to allow us to do that.
That's a nice optimistic note to end on, Rachel. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Paulette. Thank you, Reuben, all of you for sharing your insight. It's really been a fascinating discussion on a topic I think that is on everyone's mind as we move forward. Thank you again to Accenture for partnering with us on today's event. Thank you to all of you for joining us. If you've enjoyed today, please do look at more of our virtual briefings on business, tech, politics, science, much more, wired.co.uk. We are hosting a business event, Wired Smarter, as a virtual conference this year, October 13th to 15th. Please do join us. We'll be looking at a lot more around innovation and how we can respond strategically to significant events like COVID, and think about how we want to shape the world moving forward in terms of the business environment. And if you've joined today, you can get a 30% discount for that if you email Wired Events at condenast.co.uk, Wired Events at condenast.co.uk. In the meantime, thank you to our panelists. Thank you for joining us. Stay well, and we will hopefully see you soon. Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye now.